The first option that the atheist has, if he wants to reject God as the ground of morality, is that he must show that the biblical worldview is incoherent on its own terms, or else he must apply an alternative foundation for objective morality. The first one, right, the internal coherence. The atheist may say, okay, I'm not arguing that God's actions are immoral as measured by some external standard. Rather, I'm saying that God's actions are immoral given the truth of Christianity. Okay, here the atheist is assuming that Christianity is true just for the sake of argument, saying, okay, let's say that objective moral values and duties are grounded in God, okay? And then showing how the morality exemplified then in the Bible is incompatible with itself. So let me give you some examples. The Bible teaches that God is loving, but then it also teaches that some people will end up in hell. How could a loving God allow people to go to hell, right? The atheist here would be using the Bible's own, right, standards of morality, a loving God, and then people go to hell. How can you reconcile those two? To give an example more pertinent to Old Testament, the Bible teaches that all people are created equal. If that's the case, how come God allows slavery in the Bible then? Right? Likewise, if all people are created equal, why is there misogyny in the Bible? Okay, the atheist here is not trying to argue against the morality of the Old Testament from some objective external standard that's not God. The atheist is simply saying, let's take you at your word that God is the standard of morality, but given your own standard, he doesn't basically live up to it. The second alternative is the one we're mainly going to be focusing on today, and that's if the atheist chooses to reject God as the grounds of objective morality, he must propose alternatives, right, for objective morality. The two that are mainly proposed are atheistic evolution and atheistic moral Platonism. I'm going to go ahead and explain the evolution one, and then offer my thoughts, and then explain the atheistic moral Platonism, and offer my thoughts. So, naturalistic evolution. The idea is straightforward. Moral values and duties are not grounded in any transcendent reality, but are instead the byproduct of natural selection. On this view, what we call morality is simply a set of behavioral patterns that prove to be advantageous for survival and the reproduction of our species. Just as a troop of baboons exhibits cooperative and even sacrificial behavior because such behavior aids the group in its struggle for survival, so humans exhibit similar behavior for the same reason. For instance, parents feel that they have an obligation to take care of their children. Why? Well, according to this view, parents think this because such behavior, taking care of children, is conducive to human survival. Consequently, over the years, evolution has hardwired this belief into us, much like it hardwired other survival instincts such as the fight or flight response. What are my thoughts about this alternative for objective morality? Well, my first thought is, even if evolution explains why we feel moral obligations, it doesn't establish that those obligations objectively exist. Let me explain myself. Let's say the evolutionary process explains why we have come to think some actions are right and some actions are wrong. But here's a problem. Explaining why we feel obligated is not the same as establishing that we are obligated, that we have moral duties. Evolution has no way of getting us from the is of nature to the ought of genuine moral obligation. I'll sometimes joke with Laura and tell her that I feel it's my duty to beat up jerk drivers on the street, so they stop endangering people. And I was able to swerve or brake or whatever, but someone else with a family might not be so lucky. So I tell her, I think it's my solemn duty to just pull over and beat them up, teach them a lesson so they stop doing this. Unfortunately, I still haven't been able to demonstrate that I actually have that duty. So I feel like I have the duty, but I haven't been able to demonstrate that I have that duty. Joking aside, in the same way, we may think we really ought to love our children. But if evolution is the grounds of morality, that sense of obligation, as strong and compelling as it might seem, is just an adaptive instinct, not a reflection of moral reality. As atheistic evolutionist Michael Ruse explains, the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation no less than our hands and feet and teeth, considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something. Ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. Another way you can think about this or frame this is that on an atheistic view of things, human beings are just animals, right? But animals have no moral obligations to one another. The ethicist Richard Taylor illustrates this point quite powerfully by inviting us to imagine human beings living in a state of nature without any customs or laws. Suppose one of them kills another one and takes his goods. Taylor reflects, such actions, though injurious to their victims, are no more unjust or immoral than they would be if done by one animal to another. A hawk that seizes a fish from the sea kills it, but it does not murder it. And another hawk that seizes the fish from the talons of the first takes it, but does not steal it. For none of these things is forbidden, and exactly the same considerations apply to the people we are imagining. Well, some atheists here, they want to preserve objective morality. They don't want to say like Bruce did that. It's just like hands and feet. It's just for survival. So they want to avoid that is and not problem that we just covered. So they will just simply insist that whatever contributes to human flourishing is good, and whatever detracts from human flourishing is bad. Why is inflicting harm on other people wrong? It simply is. Objectively, don't you agree? That's what ethicist Walter Armstrong remarked in a debate once. And yeah, we can agree with them, right? Inflicting unjustified harm on others is wrong. We agree with that. But that's not the question, right? The question is whether there is a reason to believe that that is the case on atheism, right? Specifically evolution. I think specifically this response runs into the problem of arbitrariness. Okay? We happen to admire the morality that evolution has passed on to us. But as William Lane Craig puts it, if the film of evolutionary history were rewound and shot anew, very different creatures with a very different set of values might well have evolved. By what right do we regard our morality as objective rather than theirs? To borrow from Michael Ruse again, he gives us two thought experiments. He says, suppose humans had evolved needing to dwell in darkness, eat at each other's waste, and cannibalize the dead. In that case, we would likely extol such acts as beautiful and moral and find it morally disgusting to live in the open air, dispose of body waste, and bury the dead. In other words, we would praise the exact opposite of some of the things we do now. Or can't we conceive of rational beings on another planet, so aliens, smart aliens, for whom rape carried no moral stigma? If they visited Earth, why should they defer or respect the values that have evolved among humans? Likewise, is there any reason we couldn't have evolved to believe that killing the weak is noble or feel obligated to cannibalize the weak? Such behavior happens all the time in the animal kingdom. The point is, why regard humans as special and therefore make human flourishing, right, the ultimate stopping point? If evolution is the foundation for morality, then we must acknowledge that our moral convictions could have been radically different. Different creatures could have evolved to feel just as strongly about moral values and duties that run contrary to ours. This makes the explanatory ultimate of human flourishing look less like an objective foundation and more like an arbitrary survival strategy from people who haven't accepted the full implications of their worldview. The first problem I raise with this that I see is just because we feel like we have moral obligation, it doesn't mean that we actually do have a moral obligation. Okay, we know that feelings are not the same as reality, right? A lot of times, and Michael Ruse, himself an atheist, says it would be on atheism and evolution. It would just be like adaptation for survival, like hands and feet. Another way you can think about this is an odd distinction, is that, well, on atheism, we are just animals, but animals don't have moral obligations to one another. When a hawk gets a fish and kills it, we don't say, oh, he murdered it, and we put him in jail, right? Something like that, because it's a hawk. And animals, they have no moral obligations. But if we are just animals, then why are you applying moral obligations to us? The atheist here could respond that, well, let's take human flourishing as basically the basis for objective moral values and duties, okay? And the problem with this, I think, is that it's very arbitrary. Evolution, our moral values and duties on evolution could have been radically different, okay? If we, like William Lane Craig tells us, if we rewound the film of evolutionary history, very different creatures with very different moral values and duties could have evolved. And then if you think about the aliens, right? If they come to Earth and for them rape isn't wrong, why should they defer to human flourishing as the explanatory ultimate and not the alien from X planet, right? Finally, even if evolution does ground objective moral values and duties, you can't trust your moral beliefs under evolution. So what I'm saying here is, even if the two arguments I just gave, let's throw them out, forget about them, okay? So even if evolution does ground objective moral values and duties, the problem it runs into is that you can't trust your moral beliefs under evolution because they were aimed at survival, not truth. Let me explain myself. If we're nothing more than the products of naturalistic evolution, trying to fight, feed, flee, and reproduce, why trust the convictions of our minds, whether about truth or morality? As I already mentioned, evolution is about survival of the fittest. Mutations happen at random over the course of time. Some of these mutations prove to be advantageous, while others not so much. By advantageous, of course, we simply mean keep you alive long enough to pass on your genes. So the organism that receives the advantageous mutation is now more likely to survive. In turn, the organism, that organism passes this genetic mutation on to its offspring, making them more likely to survive, and so forth. What about the organisms that didn't get the advantageous mutation, that didn't get the new iOS update? Right? They die off. Notice what natural selection is not selecting for: truth. It is selecting for fitness or survival. Sure, sometimes true beliefs will help you survive, okay? Like believing that if you fall off a building, you jump off a building, you're going to die, right? That true belief will help you survive. But false beliefs could do the trick as well. For example, a caveman might believe that every rustle in the grass is a tiger. That would be a false belief because that's not the case every time. Yet that paranoia keeps him alive longer than the guy who correctly believes most rustles are just the wind. The point is, on evolution, survival trumps truth. Okay? So why think our moral beliefs are any different? We might be hardwired to believe that humans are valuable or that we have moral duties because those beliefs might help us survive as a species. But why think they actually correspond to an objectively existing realm of moral values and duties? As William Lane Craig puts it, because our moral beliefs have been selected by evolution, not for their truth, but for their survival value, we can have no confidence in the deliverances of our moral experience. Now, let me clarify. I am not arguing that tracing a belief back to evolution automatically makes it false. We can trace our moral beliefs to evolution, therefore our moral beliefs are false, and so objective moral values and duties do not exist. Such an argument would be clearly fallacious. In fact, it's so common that it has its own name. It's called the genetic fallacy. Okay? Let me illustrate. Pretend you're talking with a friend and you inform him, hey, I know you probably don't know this, but 2 + 2 = 4. You'd think your friend would respond with a stank face or a snide remark, but instead, he wags his finger and exclaims, you only believe that because your kindergarten teacher told you so. To which you should respond, actually, my VBK teacher taught me that, but what does that have to do with whether 2 + 2 = 4? How silly of your friend, right? Let's do some more pretending. Now you are talking with your friend and you inform him that you believe in God. And you offer evidence for why God exists, to which your friend responds, that's great, but you only believe in God because you were raised a Christian. Both of these imaginary responses run into a very real problem. Namely, a belief can be true regardless of how it came to be held. So you cannot disprove a belief by showing how it originated, how it came about. So what is it that I am trying to do? What I am attempting to do is undermine the warrant or the justification for trusting in our moral beliefs, given a purely evolutionary framework. Basically, even if we grant that evolution is the foundation for moral values and duties, we should have no confidence in our moral beliefs because they came about through a process aimed at survival, not truth. Okay? So we have examined the most common alternative phrase for objective moral values and duties, naturalistic evolution. There's another one called atheistic moral Platonism. Does this alternative fare any better? So let's explain this view. On this view, moral values are not grounded in God, but in a non-theistic, transcendent which means beyond the physical or natural world here, realm of moral truths. So, moral values are not grounded in God, but in a non-theistic, transcendent realm of moral truths. They simply exist as brute facts. Just as some philosophers believe numbers or other abstract objects exist apart from us, so too moral properties like justice, mercy, or love are said to exist independently of human beings. On this account, goodness, justice, and love are objective features of reality itself. I have 3 responses to this. The first is, what does it mean to say, for example, that the moral value justice just exists? It's hard to know what to make of this. It's clear what is meant when we say that a person is just, but it's kind of confusing or bewildering when it is said that in the absence of any people, justice itself exists just out there. Moral values seem to exist as properties of persons, not as mere abstractions. Curiously, since the abstract object justice is not itself just, it would seem to follow that in the absence of any people, justice does not exist, which contradicts the hypothesis because it says it is objective, independent of humans. My second critique of this view is that it cannot account for moral duties. The nature of moral duty or obligation seems incompatible with atheistic moral Platonism. Let's suppose that moral values do exist independently of God. Values like mercy, justice, love, and the like just exist. How does that result in any moral obligations for me? If you recall our last class, we made an important distinction between values and duties. And I said one of the reasons why I think there is a distinction is because I think we can easily see how something can be good for you, something can be a moral like value, right? Good for you, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily obligated to do it. Okay? Why would I have a moral duty, say, to be merciful? On this view, vices such as greed, hatred, and selfishness also presumably exist as abstract objects. Why am I obligated to align my life with one set of these abstractly existing objects rather than the others? And the last critique is that I think it is highly unlikely that blind evolution would produce creatures whose moral beliefs just happen to correspond to the abstractly existing realm of moral values. It's almost as if the moral realm knew that we were coming. Okay, let me put that a little more simply, I guess. Basically, on this view, there are 2 independent realms of reality. There is the natural, the physical realm, and then there is the moral realm. Okay, what are the odds that unguided evolution, so the natural realm, would produce creatures whose moral beliefs aligned with the transcendent moral order? That is extremely implausible. It is far more plausible to regard both the natural realm and the moral realm as under the authority of a divine creator and lawgiver than to think that these 2 entirely independent orders of reality just happen to mesh. Which actually leads me to the final thing that we're going to cover today. We have been talking about in the past 2 classes this claim: if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Okay? This is a negative claim about the inadequacy of a godless universe to ground morality. By contrast, what I'm going to offer now is the positive claim that moral values and duties are best grounded in the existence of God. I am by no means setting out to prove this claim. All I am setting out to do is provide one plausible way in which God may serve as the objective basis of moral values and duties. To put things differently, it would be a logical mistake to say, right, I prove this claim, let's say. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. I hope you guys can see that that's not the same as saying that God is the grounds of objective moral values and duties. That's saying if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties don't exist. But that's different from proving that God is the foundation of moral values and duties. Okay? And basically what I'm saying is, I'm not setting out to prove that. All I'm saying, I'm going to give you one theory of the relationship between God and objective moral values and duties. Okay? And this this theory is called divine command theory. So, our duties. Our moral duties are constituted by the commands of an essentially just and loving God. Since our moral duties are grounded in the divine commands, they are not independent of God. Let's put this a little more formally. An action A is required of moral agent S. So action A, so A just stands in for any hypothetical action, is required of moral agent S, let's say Kevin, okay, moral agent, if and only if a just and loving God commands S to do A. An action A is forbidden to S if and only if a just and loving God commands S not to do A. An action is permitted for S if and only if a just and loving God does not command S not to do it. If we want to summarize that, ethical wrongness is the property of being contrary to the commands of a loving God. That's what Robert Adams says. Okay. But what about values? Okay, we have duties, but what about values? God's commands are not arbitrary, for they are necessary expressions of his just and loving nature. God is essentially, or by nature, compassionate, fair, kind, impartial, and so forth, and his commandments are reflections of his own character. God's character is definitive of moral goodness. It serves as the paradigm of moral goodness. Let's put those two together. Thus, the morally good or bad, so values, is determined by reference to God's nature. The morally right or wrong, so we're talking about duties here, are determined by reference to his will. The divine will or commands come into play as a source of moral obligation, not moral value. As necessary expressions of his nature, his commands are not arbitrary. Okay? Looking forward, next week we're going to be covering chapter 3 and 4 of our book, Paul Copan's book, and we're going to be touching on divine pride and jealousy.